Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Hathcock again. And with this topic, we're going to be looking at territorial expansion, which is basically westward expansion. And then we'll conclude this topic with the Mexican-American War. And really, this topic is heavy on the expansion of the United States all the way out to the Pacific. All right, now, in looking at foreign policy under President Tyler, um, this is the one area where he actually had some success. You'll recall he did not pass the third bank of the United States. He and the Whig leadership, especially Clay, were fighting with each other. So there's not a lot of successes here on Tyler's watch. But one area of success is this Webster-Ashburton Treaty that you can see here. Now, looking at settling problems with Great Britain, if you look at the map on the bottom right-hand side, and kind of look where you see northern Maine and kind of northern Minnesota. We really didn't have a clear idea of what belonged to the United States and what belonged to Canada or the British in those areas. And you can see where it has the little lines ceded by Britain, Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. Well, this caused a bit of a problem along the way, especially in Upper Maine. Some Canadian lumberjacks came down into Maine and started cutting down trees in the map area, that's sort of dark green. American lumberjacks came into that same valley to cut down trees, saw the Canadians there. A bit of an argument broke out, and both sides said, hey, you're not supposed to be here. This isn't your land. Well, the Americans left and did a very American thing. They got their guns and they came back into the valley and they shot at these Canadian lumberjacks. Then the Canadians ran out of the valley. They started to weapon up, armed to the teeth, to come back in. And it's not that anyone's, I don't know, doing something wrong here. It's just that we don't have a clear map and we don't know what belongs to the United States and then what belongs to Canada. So we need a clear map here, is the point. Eventually, the U.S. Army had to be sent in to that area to sort of keep the peace, keep lumberjacks from shooting at each other. So our Secretary of State at that moment, the fellow on the bottom left-hand side, a fellow by the name of Daniel Webster, he will travel to England to try to figure this out, hammer out some sort of an understanding as far as our maps are concerned. His British counterpart, the guy who he will negotiate with, is Lord Ashburton. So that's why it's called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, we get a more clearly defined map along the U.S.-Canadian border in Maine, as well as in Minnesota. And then if you look way off to the far left-hand side, you can see what's called the Oregon country, that dark green in the northwest of the continent. The Oregon country actually extended on up into Canada as well, truth be told. Now, we didn't really know who owned that part of the world. There were American settlers there, but there were also some Canadian settlers there as well. But one thing we did know is we didn't want any other countries in that part of the world. Specifically, they didn't want Mexico getting into that part of the world. And also, if our map extended a little further up to the north, you would see Russia. And the Russians own Alaska. They're kind of making some land grabs along the coast of modern-day Canada. So in an effort to keep the Russians and Mexico out of the Oregon country, the United States agreed to what we call joint occupation of Oregon. Webster-Ashburton Treaty does a lot of things, actually, but just specific to our topic, it clearly defines the border in Maine, Minnesota, and calls for joint occupation of the Oregon country. All right, just real quick for Daniel Webster. So he was supposed to be Harrison's Secretary of State. You recall Harrison died. But Daniel Webster, he comes to us from Massachusetts, which is MA on your postal codes. And yeah, he's going to be very vocal in his opposition to slavery as we go forward as a class. He really saw slavery as an evil institution. He was really opposed to its spread any further on out to the west. So Daniel Webster is going to be a player in things to come as well. All right, well, this is one of Tyler's few successes, is this Webster-Ashburton Treaty with the British government. I guess his other success, though it took forever, would be Texas. So now let's look at Texas and the role that it plays in the expansion of the United States to the west. All right, the year 1821 is a big year in Texas history. A lot of things happened that year. Let's see, for starters, in 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain. So Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, heck, even Colorado, Utah, places like that. All those places were now under the control of the government of Mexico. Mexico was a really big nation down to the southwest. So in 1821, Mexico wins its independence from Spain. Now, along the way, Spain, before she lost her Mexican territories, was really big on the idea of trying to get people to settle in this thing called Texas. And one thing that Spain started doing was hiring men who were called impresarios. And the whole point of being an impresario was to convince settlers to move to Texas. The Spanish government would pay these men so many dollars per families that moved, that settled into Texas. And one man in particular who got involved in this impresario business was a man named Moses Austin. Now, we'll talk about his son, Stephen F., here in just a minute. But the Austin family, they come to us, Kentucky, but then they move into Missouri. Moses Austin was, it was okay. He was doing okay financially until that Panic of 1819 hit. You'll remember the depression that we talked about previously before. And with that depression, the Austin family lost their fortune. They really did hit some hard times. And Moses Austin agreed to be an impresario for the Spanish because he's trying to rebuild his family's fortune, trying to get their financial situation stable again. So Moses Austin signs a contract with the Spanish government to be an impresario to get people to move to this thing called Texas. Now Moses made sure that this was cleared up in the contract that he signed. He basically said, okay, so these people who are going to move to this thing called Texas, they're probably going to be from the southern parts of the United States. They're going to come for the cheap land that you can grow cotton on. And he just asked a basic question. He wanted to know if they could bring their slaves. Well, the Spanish Empire doesn't really have a problem with slavery at all. They said that's fine by us. So, yes, Moses Austin is allowed to bring settlers to this thing called Texas, and these settlers can bring their slaves. All right, well, then Mexico wins its independence. It agrees to honor the contracts of those impresarios, such as Moses Austin. They also want to get settlers into this thing called Texas. And then later in 1821, Moses Austin died. Tragically, he passed away. The government of Mexico preserved his body. When the time of year was good for traveling, they actually, a couple of men took Moses Austin's body back to his family up in Missouri. And they took the Moses Austin's remains to his son, Stephen F. Austin. That was a really nice gesture by the government of Mexico. But those men traveled with that body not just to be nice. They also made an offer to Stephen F. Austin. And they said, look, your father signed this contract. We're still willing to honor the terms of the contract. Are you willing to fulfill your father's contract? Well, Stephen F. Austin didn't have a lot going on at that moment. Like I said previously, the family's fortune was destroyed by the Depression. So he says, yes, he'll do it. He agrees to work as an impresario. And Stephen F. Austin, as it turns out, is a tremendous salesman. If he were alive in today's world, he'd probably be running a Fortune 500 company. And Stephen F. Austin did an amazing job of convincing settlers to move to this thing called Texas. Wasn't too hard to sell. Land sold at about 75% cheaper in Texas than it was selling in the United States. The land in Texas was really ripe for agriculture, for crops, really good for cotton in particular. So Stephen F. Austin convinced a lot of people from the American South to move to this thing called Texas for cheap land and the ability to grow cotton. And yes, they could bring their slaves with them to this thing called Texas. It's also kind of amazing, like how many people from Tennessee came to Texas. All across the Tennessee countryside in the early 1820s, people were just leaving their homes, and they'd put up these sort of makeshift signs, and they would carve into the wood GTT, which was basically short for Gone to Texas. A lot of Tennessee people came to Texas in the early 1820s. All right, well, along the way, these Anglo farmers from the American South, in becoming Texans, like, going to Mexico, they had to agree to certain terms or certain conditions. Number one, these Anglo Americans were supposed to learn how to speak Spanish. That was part of the deal, is that upon arrival they would learn how to speak Spanish. They were also to become citizens of Mexico, fill out the paperwork and all that sort of stuff, and become legally citizens of Mexico. And also they were expected to attend Catholic Church. There's no separation of church and state in Mexico. The official religion is the Catholic faith. So yeah, these Anglo Americans who come to Texas have to learn how to speak Spanish, become citizens of Mexico, and go to Catholic Church. Well, a lot of these good old boy farmers arrive in Texas and they didn't do any of those things. They didn't bother to try to learn the language, except the basics that they needed to get along. Very few, if any of them, actually ever took the tests to become citizens of Mexico. And Bubba leaving Tennessee, he rarely went to church when he lived in Tennessee, and he wasn't going to start going to church now that he lived in Texas. In fact, a lot of these farmers who moved to Texas, their attitude was, "Hey, you know what? I'll pay my taxes. Just leave me alone. Just let me run my farm. Let me grow my stuff. I'll pay my taxes. I understand I got to do that. Just leave me alone." Really was their attitude. Well, as time wore on, these Texans, these white Anglo farmer Texans, they started to have a little bit of a political power in what was Texas at that time. And in an effort to kind of offset that Anglo domination of politics, looking at point number 2, something called Coahuila, Texas was formed in 1824. And the idea behind Coahuila, Texas was to add more Hispanic voters to that region. Coahuila was a state within the nation of Mexico, just like Texas was. And what the Mexican government did is it combined those two states into one big state, so that now you would have more Hispanic voters in this thing called Coahuila, Texas. Those Anglo farmers knew what was going on. They saw right through it. They were not happy at all. And they really just wanted Texas to be left alone and not be added to this thing called Coahuila. All right, well, along the way, fast forwarding our story just a little bit, there's a fellow by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna who comes to power there in Mexico. Now, Santa Anna was voted into power, but shortly after taking power, it turns out that Santa Anna was not a very nice man. In fact, he was a bit of a brute. He was a bit of a dictator. And Santa Anna, in becoming the president and then very quickly dictator of Mexico, decided that he wanted to do some things with regards to Texas and these Texas farmers. Now, I forgot to mention this, so I can go ahead and do it here. Sorry about that. But along the way in 1827, Mexico actually outlawed slavery. They did it decades before the United States would. But there were a lot of those farmers there in Texas who had brought slaves with them who were very upset when that move was made. And those Anglo farmers were saying, look, if I'd have known you were going to free my slaves, I never would have come here. I never would have bought this land. So in an effort to appease these slaveholders, these Anglo farmers in Texas, the nation of Mexico allowed these Texas farmers to sign their slaves to what are called indentured servant contracts. That's kind of a blast from the past, right? You might remember when we started this topic, we were looking at Virginia and Jamestown and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, the idea here was in all the other states of Mexico, slavery is illegal. But here in Texas, these farmers can sign their slaves to indentured servant contracts, with the idea being that at some point those slaves will be freed. So it's kind of a temporary stopgap to just appease Texas farmers. You can keep your slaves for a little bit more, but then they're going to be freed. Well, they gave Texas farmers an inch and they took a mile. What these Texas farmers did is they signed their slaves up for these ridiculous contracts. They basically said, if my slave works for me for 99 years, I'll free him and give him 10 acres of land or something like that. They set the terms of the contract so far that it wasn't really possible for these people to live that long and to get their freedom. All right, so now fast forward beyond 1827, Santa Anna comes to power, and he is talking about freeing the slaves that live in Texas. He said, that's ridiculous that you can sign your slaves to what are essentially lifetime contracts. That's not an indentured contract. That's not an avenue to freedom. So he's threatening to free the slaves of Texas. That really had him fighting mad at that point. He also decided to cut off all immigration from the United States. Santa Anna shut down immigration from the United States. He felt like these Anglo farmers were having too much of an impact on things. So, they actually had the Mexican army up there along the Red River in the Sabine, patrolling to keep immigrants from coming in to this thing called Texas. With that, he also cut off all trade with the United States. A lot of those Texas farmers, they like to buy their products from Louisiana. They also like to sell their cotton in Louisiana because they got better prices for it. So Santa Anna is basically cutting Texas off from the United States. No more immigration, no trade. He also told these Texas farmers that they were going to have to start living up to their obligations, learn Spanish, to become citizens, and to go to Catholic Church. I should also say this, Santa Anna didn't just rub Texans wrong. He really rubbed most of the people living in Mexico wrong. Like even people living out in California were upset at this guy and saw him as a dictator. But it is in Texas in particular where they began to rebel against Santa Anna. Texans began to form militia units. And look, of all the things that Santa Anna did, the Texans were mad at all of it. But that threat to free their slave property is really what triggered the Texas Revolution more than anything else. All right, in 1835, militia units began to form. They began to train. The first sort of dust up happened in the small town of Gonzales, Texas. There was a cannon in the city. They'd been there for a long time. It's sort of been left there years before. But the Mexican army knew that the people of Gonzales had a cannon. They hear this talk of militia and stuff, so they don't want that cannon to end up in the wrong hands. So some members of the Mexican army marched to Gonzales and basically demand that the cannon be given back. Armed men in Gonzales sort of refused to give the cannon up, and the mayor of Gonzales basically tells the Mexican army to come and take it, and that'll be one of the mottos of the Texas Revolution: "Come and take it." Mexican army realized they didn't have enough men to come over there and take it. But that act of defiance at Gonzales, it really is seen as the triggering of the Texas Revolution. All right, well, Santa Anna, that fellow at the bottom middle of our slide, he doesn't like all these acts of defiance. He doesn't like this talk of revolution in Texas. So in late 1835, Santa Anna mobilizes a large army. He'll march it north. It'll eventually cross the Rio Grande in 1836. And Santa Anna, in marching into Texas in 1836, he is coming to I don't know, make an example out of Texas. He's not really in a prisoner-taking mood. And what he's saying in this moment is, you don't defy me, you don't rebel against me. This is how I treat rebels. And what he's about to do to Texas is his message to California, to Nevada, to all the rest of Mexico. You don't defy me. And if you do, this is what happens. So he's there to end rebellion. He's not in a prisoner taking mood. Santa Anna is going to make an example out of Texas for the rest of his empire of Mexico. All right, well, the biggest city in Texas at that time was San Antonio. And San Antonio, in many ways, was like a crossroads. So many roads came in and out of San Antonio. Now, it was pretty clear that Santa Anna was going to head towards the city of San Antonio, Texas. Texans who had mobilized began to take up their positions on the outskirts of San Antonio in an old Spanish mission called the Alamo. And it was there that they decided that they would make their stand, that they would try to stop the advance of Santa Anna's army across Texas. So, yeah, the Alamo in these moments will become legendary, as it's that stand against Santa Anna's invasion of Texas. As men are arriving in San Antonio and taking up position in the Alamo, there in early February, early to mid-February of 1836, other Texans were meeting at a small town called Washington on the Brazos. And at Washington on the Brazos, Texas leaders met to discuss the next steps, what to do. Obviously, they're going to fight back, they're going to defend themselves. But at Washington on the Brazos, Texas leaders openly discussed the idea of declaring independence, forming a new nation, the Republic of Texas. A lot of discussions happened over several weeks. Stephen F. Austin was there. At the end of the day, by early March of 1836, those leaders at Washington on the Brazos decided to declare independence. It's a really long document. I've actually seen it with my own eyes. They have it down at the State Library in Austin. A lot of it does read like the the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But in the Texas Declaration of Independence, they also make it very clear that they feel that men are entitled to slave property. So, you know, that's one of the big points of fighting this war is their right to slave property. So these Texans are deciding not just to fight against the dictator Santa Anna, they're now fighting for independence for this newly created Republic of Texas. Well, the question at that point was who's going to lead this revolution? Who's going to lead the military and fighting Santa Anna? There were some people who said it ought to be Stephen F. Austin, but I don't know. He's not really a military guy. He's a lot of things, but military just isn't one of them. But as it turns out, Sam Houston would be the logical choice to lead the Texas Revolution. He really had more combat experience than anybody else who was there. And Sam Houston, he had served under Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812. I recall I talked about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and I said he was one of the guys who got injured in that fight. But after the War of 1812, Sam Houston kind of rode the coattails of Andrew Jackson. They were very good friends. But Sam Houston got involved in politics. He would be elected to the United States Congress as a senator along the way. He also was the governor of the state of Tennessee. And yeah, he had quite a political career going for himself. Somewhere along the way, he also fell in love with a young woman, married her, and on their wedding night, something happened. We're not quite sure what happened. He never really would discuss what had gone on. But for whatever reason, on their wedding night, she got cold feet. She left. She went back to her parents. She didn't want to be married to him. So that kind of ended their marriage right there. But at that point, he was dejected, heartbroken, and sad. He started drinking very heavily. As a result, he's not reelected to political office. His life's falling apart. He's becoming an alcoholic. He bottomed out so bad that he wound up living with the Cherokee. They allowed him to live amongst them. They sort of felt sympathetic for the guy. And there's this story that it was Sam Houston who told. He said that he was ready to end his life, that he'd bottomed out and he didn't see a future. So he said he went by a little creek. He had a pistol, and he stood up, he cocked the pistol, and he was looking to the west, and he was getting ready to kill himself. When suddenly this eagle came flying over his head, kind of whooshed right over his head, and this eagle was heading out to the west with its wings spread wide open. And Sam Houston said that he took that as a symbol to put down the gun, to not go through with it, and to head off to the west, that there might be opportunity for him out to the west. So Sam Houston ultimately decides to come to Texas. In fact, there are some letters that he wrote back and forth with Andrew Jackson, and Jackson was telling him that Texas sounded like a paradise, that he should go and see what Texas had to offer. With that letter, there are a lot of people who say that Jackson sent Houston as a spy to go spy on the situation in Texas. That's not really the case. He was just looking out for his friend. He'd heard good things about Texas, so off Sam Houston goes. And as it turns out, Sam Houston was great for Texas, and Texas was great for Sam Houston. They were just perfect for each other. Sam arrives in Texas, works hard, saves up enough money to buy himself some land, starts to become a bit of a businessman, a wealthy sort of a fellow there in Texas. And Texas is going into a revolution. He's one of the gentlemen who's meeting there in Washington on the Brazos. And he is chosen to lead the Army of Texas. It's now his job to win that revolution going forward. It's always been kind of a controversial aspect of this. Like once Sam Houston took over the Army of Texas, he understood that it needed to be trained. Like it needed to learn how to march and about face and fight and things like that. And in his heart of hearts, he really did want to go to the Alamo and relieve those boys down there. But he also understood that if he just rushed off like that to the Alamo, it might spell certain doom for his army because they really weren't ready for a fight. But as fate would have it, the Alamo was about to fall anyway, as Sam Houston was being put in charge of the Texas Army. As men were declaring independence at Washington on the Brazos, in early March of 1836, the Alamo will eventually fall to Santa Anna's forces. The Alamo held on for 10 miraculous days, and it really is a miracle that it held on as long as it did. Heavily outnumbered by Santa Anna's army, they just kept repelling assault after assault. But finally, in early March of 1836, Santa Anna's forces do manage to break through the walls, knock out the defenses there at the Alamo. In the process, they kill most of the men who were there at the Alamo. And when the fighting is over with, Santa Anna will allow for a handful of people to live. The women who were there were allowed to go. There were a couple of slaves there who were allowed to go as well. But all the Anglo men, all the white men who were there at the Alamo, the ones who were left alive, they were summarily executed at the end of the battle. And it's not just that they were summarily executed. A lot of these guys were hacked to pieces with swords, things like that. Sort of a brutal way to go. That includes Davy Crockett, the guy on the bottom right-hand side with the coonskin cap. Poor guy. He came from Tennessee looking for the opportunity to start a new life, right? Cheap land and opportunity. He arrives just in time for a revolution, kind of gets sucked into helping with the defense at San Antonio. It's going to go on to cost him his life. So Santa Anna is dealing with the rebellion. He does not take any prisoners at the Alamo. And again, that's him sending that message. I don't take any prisoners. This is what I do with rebels. They die a horrible death. Santa Anna did that along the way at other battles as well. In particular, there's another battle at a place called Goliad, where when it's over, Santa Anna starts executing all the prisoners again. At some point, Santa Anna's own army was sickened by what was happening. They saw it as nothing short of murder. And Santa Anna's own officers told him that if he ordered them to kill any more prisoners, they would stop, that they would rebel, and they would take the soldiers back home to Mexico. So even Santa Anna's own soldiers were growing tired of his act. This is brutal treatment of prisoners. All right. But it turns out when you actually take prisoners, you can ask them some questions. You might be able to get some information out of them. And Santa Anna starts to figure out that there's some guy named Houston. He's in charge of something called the Army of Texas. And it's somewhere off in the east piney woods of Texas, training and preparing to fight. So using sort of the Gulf of Mexico as a guide, Santa Anna takes his army towards the east in search of Sam Houston. Sam Houston did take the Army of Texas into the piney woods of East Texas, the forest. Even in today's world, it's hard. It's easy to get lost in those piney woods. It's a great place to hide and train. So eventually, Sam Houston comes out of the woods with an army that's ready to fight. Santa Anna is headed towards those piney woods, looking for that fight. And as it turns out, their destinies were to meet at a place called San Jacinto. It's just outside of modern-day Houston, Texas. And at this Battle of San Jacinto, the Texas Army has the element of surprise. They attack the Mexican force, Santa Anna's force, at the break of dawn. And in April of 1836, the Texas Revolution comes to an end with this climactic battle at San Jacinto. And it's a big victory for Sam Houston, for Texans, as they defeat Santa Anna's army. That picture on the top right-hand side, you can see a guy laying on a blanket. That's Sam Houston. He twisted his ankle that day, poor guy. That painting is actually in our Texas State Capitol down in Austin. You'll also see there's a guy standing there with white pants on and a blue shirt. That's Santa Anna. He was captured as the battle was coming to an end. He took off his general's outfit and tried to put on the outfit of a private. Tried to escape with his guys who were running. But some other people recognize him and he's captured. And you'll see a lot of guys sitting around that tree. What a lot of those guys would like to do is put a rope around one of those branches, fasten it around Santa Anna's neck, and hang him right there where he stands. This is the Butcher of the Alamo. This is the guy who mistreated prisoners at Goliad as well. They'd really just like to hang him right there from that tree. But instead, Sam Houston said, no, he's more, we can use this guy. We can have leverage with this guy. And Santa Anna will be forced to sign certain terms of surrender. He will eventually be sent back to the nation of Mexico with those terms of surrender. And basically, in winning the Battle of San Jacinto, Texans forced Mexico to admit that, number one, Texas is free. That's one thing they're demanding of Mexico is Texas's freedom. That number two, there is a Republic of Texas that extends all the way to the Rio Grande and then on up into the Oregon country. Like it goes all the way along the Rio Grande to where it ends in present-day Colorado. And then from there it shoots straight up north to the Oregon country. Now, Texas really historically had been what you see in yellow on that bottom left-hand map. Texas historically had gone to the Nueces River. It's kind of what empties into Corpus Christi. But now with this new nation form, Texans are saying, actually, we want all that land in green as well. We're going to the Rio Grande and then north up to the Oregon country. All right, well, Mexico never would accept any of those agreements. Mexico said that when Santa Anna was captured, he was afraid for his life. Any agreements that he made were done under the duress of fear for his life. So Mexico refuses to recognize that Texas is free and independent. And Mexico really refuses to recognize the Texas goes all the way to the Rio Grande. Mexico's response is, look, even if Texas was free, which it ain't, but even if it was free, we would only recognize what you see in yellow, not all that stuff down to green. But in September of 1836, Sam Houston will be elected as the first president of the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas, once it starts, is going to have a mountain of problems. But the Lone Star Republic, it was its own country for a little while before it became a state. But the Lone Star Republic is born, Republic of Texas, in 1836. Well, right off the bat, one of the big problems that Texas had was money, debt problems. Texas had a lot of debt. It had about roughly $10 million worth of debt, which is a lot for that time, especially for such a small republic. $10 million worth of debt. Another problem that Texas had was the constant fear of an attack from Mexico. They never knew if Mexico might try to recapture Texas, reclaim it, and things like that. So they got money problems. They got the fear of an invasion, possibly from Mexico. Also, Native Americans were a problem at this time for the Republic of Texas. A group called the Lipan Apaches, in particular, a pretty nasty sort of group of people who attacked those colonies throughout the Republic of Texas. In fact, very early on, something called the Texas Rangers will be formed. And the Texas Rangers were number one about border defense, and number two about fighting Native Americans who were raiding throughout Texas. Well, with all those problems facing the new nation of Texas, Texans figured the best way to solve their problems was to become a state within the United States. And like Sam Houston was writing letters to Andrew Jackson. Jackson's still president in 1836. He'll leave the office in March of 1837. But you know, Sam Houston, right off the bat, was writing letters to Jackson saying, hey, look, we want to be annexed. We want to become a state within the United States. Annexation is being taken over. Texas wants to be taken over by the United States of America. So very early on, there was the question of annexing Texas, so-called annexation question. Well, Jackson supported the annexation of Texas, but he just had like a few months left in the White House, and off he goes. Martin Van Buren becomes the next president of the United States, and right off the bat, he's dealing with an economic crash. Texas really wasn't big on his radar, or something that he was too worried about at all. And as it turns out, I'm going to go through this step-by-step process. Well, here we go. Okay. So then it's William Henry Harrison. He dies a month into office, right? He didn't really have time to think about Texas. But John Tyler really did care about Texas, and Tyler did want Texas into the Union. He felt that it was important for Texas to be brought into the Union. But there were politicians up north who had problems with the annexation of Texas. So in looking at the Texas annexation question, let's talk about the problems facing that. Problem number one, and it is the overriding problem, is slavery. That's a lot of land, man. I mean, if you just look at how the Republic of Texas is set up right there, that is a lot of land. And people up north were afraid that this was too much land for slavery. There were people up north who were talking about something called the slave powers. There's a slave power conspiracy, that somehow this slave power had taken over our Congress. And people were terrified, up north anyway, were terrified of slavery expanding that far to the west, all there across Texas. Problem number one with the annexation of Texas is slavery. Problem number two is you don't have a clearly defined border. Okay, so we annexed Texas. What are we getting? Is it what you see on that map in yellow to the Nueces? Or is it what you see on that map all the way to green to the Rio Grande? We don't know. Sorry about that. It's trash day. Clyde really tries to protect our house from trash trucks. Sorry about that. Okay, and he made me lose my train of thought, but I'll go back over it. It's no big deal. So number one, the problem with Texas annexation is slavery. Problem number two is you don't have a clearly defined border. And problem number three is it could trigger a war with Mexico. If the United States really goes through with this and annexes Texas, Mexico will be very upset, and it's got the real potential to have a war break out between the United States and Mexico. So, in trying to get Texas annexed, those are the problems. Uh, Slavery spreading so far to the west, you really don't have a clearly defined border, and it could trigger a war between the United States and Mexico. All right, well, this annexation question, when you're dealing with the Republic of Texas, you're dealing with a foreign nation. And that means that the U.S. State Department is going to have to handle these negotiations. That means, in particular, that Daniel Webster, our Secretary of State, is sort of the point man for getting Texas into the Union. Now, you'll remember Webster, he of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty we talked about just a few minutes ago. I told you that Daniel Webster opposed slavery, that he saw it as an evil institution. And Webster told President Tyler he couldn't argue for Texas annexation. Webster said he disagreed with the move. He didn't want Texas in the Union because of slavery. So Webster did the right thing here. He resigned. He told the president that he could not fulfill his duties, his job. He resigned. He quit rather than work for the annexation of Texas. So that at that point, Tyler has to find a new Secretary of State. And the man he'll settle on is down here on the bottom, Mr. Abel Upshur. Upshur's from Virginia. He and Tyler knew each other for a long time as friends. So Abel Upshur will become the next Secretary of State under Tyler. First Secretary of State Webster couldn't do it. He sees it as evil. Second Secretary of State Upshur of Virginia. He's got no problems with the institution of slavery. And he's going to work for the annexation of Texas. All right, by all accounts, Abel Upshur did a magnificent job of working for the annexation of Texas. He had Congress on board with the idea. It really looked like Texas was about to become a state. But then in early 1844, February of 1844, this just freak horrible accident took place aboard a U.S. gunboat. It was called the USS Princeton. It's going out on its maiden voyage, its first voyage. Upshur was there. President Tyler was there. There were a lot of dignitaries aboard that boat. It's going out for its maiden voyage, and some of the boys aboard the boat, they wanted to put on a show. And they asked the captain if they could fire off the guns to see what they could do. Captain doesn't see any problem with that. All the dignitaries aboard the boat are like, heck yeah, let's see some cannon fire. So they're firing off the guns, and people are clapping. It's quite the scene. Well, on the top deck, right where Upshur is standing, along with our Secretary of the Navy at the time, a fellow named Gilmer, they're drinking champagne. They're watching this display of firepower. And below deck, the gun right below deck below them, fires, jams, and explodes, and sends what little bit is left of Abel Upshur flying out into the Atlantic Ocean. He's killed by this horrific scene as a gun goes off and blows up. President Tyler was aboard the boat. He came running up to the top deck and just talked about just the horror of the scene. Blood was everywhere. People were screaming. Body parts were lying around. It was just a horrible tragedy there aboard the boat. So the first Secretary of State quit rather than fight for Texas annexation. The second Secretary of State is blown to smithereens. By all accounts, had done a good job, but you almost had Texas in the Union. So then John Tyler decided to turn to a third Secretary of State, and I'll go with our friend John C. Calhoun, who you can see down there in the bottom right-hand corner. Our friend Calhoun has had better days. He's got that wild look in his eyes. It kind of looks like Doc Brown from Back to the Future, the 1.21 gigawatt guy. But it is now up to John C. Calhoun to try to annex Texas, to do what Tyler wants done. Well, John C. Calhoun has been down an interesting road in life. War hawk, new Republican, nationalist who becomes an ally of Jackson's, loses his political future because of a Peggy Eaton mess and tariff fights. And at this point in 1844, John C. Calhoun still believes that he has a shot of being president of the United States. If I'd have been close to old John, I would have explained to him it probably ain't gonna happen, son. All that tariff fight and you almost breaking a war or causing a war in our country, they're probably not going to put you in the White House anytime soon. But the heart wants what the heart wants. And Calhoun really still at that moment believed that he could be president of the United States. So when he takes his job of Secretary of State, he's not really working for Tyler or Texas. He's actually working for himself. He's being selfish in many ways. But he understands that if he's going to have a shot at the presidency, he has to have a unified South. The South has to collectively come together to vote for him. And even then, he's going to have to get a little bit of Northern support. But he has to have a unified South if he has any chance of being president of the United States. Well, it turns out that tariff fights aren't something that'll unify the South. Tried that, he failed. And he's trying to figure out what is something else that he could unify the South over, a common cause, a common purpose. And it was staring him in the eyes all the time, of course. Slavery is something that the South would unify over, a common defense of the institution of slavery. Now, later in our course, we'll talk about a group of people called radical abolitionists. They're already attacking the institution of slavery at this time. Calhoun is fighting with them, saying that slavery is not as evil as they're making it out to be. But one idea that Calhoun has come up with along the way, that he's really hitting hard here in 1844, is something called the positive good argument of slavery. As I explain what Calhoun believed, or at least said anyway, I don't believe this stuff. Please don't email me and get mad at me. I'm just the messenger here. I'm just telling you what Calhoun said. Our friend Calhoun was a very ardent racist. He hated pretty much everybody who was not a white male. But anyways, back to our point. Calhoun in the 1830s had made an argument that slavery was actually a beneficial thing for our country. Now, in the age of Jefferson, slavery was referred to as a necessary evil. In fact, it's Jefferson who coined that phrase, necessary evil. Jefferson had this analogy about slavery. Jefferson said that slavery is like having a wolf by the ears. You don't want to be in that situation. You don't want to hold on to a wolf by its ears. But you don't dare let go, because if you let go, the wolf will kill you. So slavery was like having a wolf by the ears. You don't really want the institution of slavery, but if you free your slaves, there's a good chance they might kill you for what you've done. Well, Calhoun in the early 1830s says, that's crazy. Slavery is not evil. In fact, he says it's a positive good. Calhoun made this argument, and again, it's Calhoun, don't get mad at me. But Calhoun, in saying that slavery was a positive good, there's layers to this. Number one, he said that God intended for slavery to be. That God intended for, quote, these children of Africa to be brought from a godless and barbaric continent to the shores of the United States, that they might have a chance at a Christian salvation. So he says the hand of God is at work here. God took these children of Africa from a godless and barbaric continent, brought them to America, they might have a chance at a Christian salvation. And how many times has the Bible been used to defend evil acts and evil deeds? Here's another one of them right here. But he's on a roll. Don't stop him. Calhoun's got more to say. Then Calhoun says that the North benefits from the institution of slavery. Says, all those people who own those factories where we send the cotton to and turn it into clothing? He says, I don't really hear a lot of those factory owners complaining about slavery because they get cheap resources that they can turn into a product and sell for a profit. So the North benefits from the institution of slavery economically. He said the South does as well. It's how Southerners make money. It's how they have any type of real revenue, real economy, is the money they make off of slavery, making those crops and those products. Then Calhoun went a little extra level crazy when he said that the slave is happy being enslaved. that the slave is content with his lot in life. Calhoun said, sure, it is true that sometimes we have to be physical with our slaves. We have to compel them to work. But overall, the slave is happy because he's fed, he's clothed, and he's given housing. So, yeah, Calhoun's saying that slaves are happy being enslaved. And of course, people laughed at that. And of course, people challenged Calhoun and said, really, you really think slaves are happy being enslaved? Come on, John. You can't believe that for real. John would just simply smile at him and say, well, I've been to the North. I've walked those streets of New York City, and I've looked in alleyways, and I've seen what you do to your workforce up there. They're starving in the streets. They're trying to scratch out a living. He says, slavery's more humane than what you're doing up there, up north with your so-called free labor. He said, at least down south, we feed, clothe, and shelter our workforce. Up north, you just pay them a penny of what they're worth and expect them to live off what little money you give. Now, I would argue that the labor system in our country is screwed up everywhere all at once. What's happening up north with the labor force ain't right. What's happening down south with the labor force definitely ain't right. Two wrongs do not make a right. The whole labor system in America really needs to be reevaluated. It does not forgive slavery. Calhoun may be right that there were problems with the free labor system up north, but that does not forgive what's happening to human beings down in the South. All right, so Calhoun comes out with that positive good talk. Now here he is in 1844 trying to argue for the annexation of Texas, and he's saying that slavery is a positive good. We should annex Texas. We should allow slavery to spread that far west because it's good for the country. It's good for the North. It's good for the South. The slave himself is happy being enslaved. So what's the problem here, Congress? Slavery is a positive thing. Let's just expand that positive institution a little further on out to the west. In the process, he angered a lot of northern politicians, but he sure did galvanize a lot of folks down south. Southerners in these moments were saying, you know what? You're right, Calhoun. This is a positive institution. And I'm a Christian man and I do right by my slaves. You know what? I used to feel bad about myself, but thank you, Calhoun, for making me feel better about things. So he is galvanizing the South in these moments. Didn't get him in the White House, but he did unify the South in this common defense of slavery as a positive good. Meanwhile, Northern congressmen are fighting mad with Calhoun because he's bringing up slavery. He's shoving it in their face that it's a positive good. They don't want the annexation of Texas. They don't want slavery spreading that far out west. And here's poor Texas in 1844 just kind of saying, hey, how's it going? We're really not into that positive good stuff. We just want to be a state. We just want to be annexed. So Texas would be made to wait a little bit longer before she could become a state. And it's been told to me this way, so I'll explain it to you this way. In these moments, John C. Calhoun really is pushing the country further towards a civil war. He's really dividing the North and the South over the institution of slavery here in these moments. 1844, the fight for the annexation of Texas. It's like, the tension with slavery was already there to begin with, but he's bringing it out into the surface. He's bringing it out into the light and openly discussing all this. And it's sort of like we're starting to get onto the highway that is the Civil War. If you want to blame one person for the Civil War, I don't think that's fair. But if we had to go through that exercise of saying, okay, who's the one person most responsible for the U.S. Civil War, you got to go with John C. Calhoun. And you got to say, in these moments of becoming a sectionalist, just arguing from a pro-South perspective, he's bitterly dividing North and South in these moments over the idea of slavery. This is a big part of what's getting us further or closer and closer to a civil war. Well, all of that is the backdrop to the election of 1844. The possible annexation of Texas, this extension of slavery on into the West. It all is the really what the campaign is about. All right, well, our friend Henry Clay is going to go for the Whig Party here in 1844. This is his third shot, his third shot at becoming president of the United States. The Whigs are admitting that they probably should have gone with him in 1840. This is, I guess, making up for the mistake that was John Tyler in a sense. So Clay will be given the nomination of the Whig Party. Now, in answering the question about Texas annexation, Clay said, at first anyway, that he opposed the annexation of Texas. He said he opposed it because they didn't really have a clearly defined border. It could lead to a war with Mexico, and he was very concerned that slavery would be very divisive for our country going forward. So Henry Clay opposes the annexation of Texas. All right, the Democratic Party in 1844 was kind of looking for a leader. There was some talk of bringing Tyler back, but most Democrats said, nah, he turned traitor, he went Whig. There's some talk about bringing back old Martin Van Buren, but I don't know, he'd had his shot. So you talk about a real dark horse coming out of nowhere. But James K. Polk will become the nominee of the Democrats here in 1844. And the reason why, more than anything, is because he really talked openly, aggressively about westward expansion all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. Polk was for the annexation of Texas, and he didn't just stop at Texas. Polk is about expanding to the west, period. His platform really was one of, we should go get Texas, and I don't care about a war with Mexico or slavery or any of that. He said we ought to have Texas. We should get as much of the Oregon country as we possibly can. And by God, we ought to go on out and get California while we're at it as well. So Polk becomes the candidate of the Democratic Party with this very aggressive westward expansion idea. Getting Texas could mean a war with Mexico. Oregon could mean a war with Britain. California, again, like Texas, could lead to a war with Mexico. But Polk doesn't care. He feels that the United States should expand to the West. Now, he didn't come up with this phrase, manifest destiny, but what he's hitting at is that this idea that it was America's destiny to head to the West. There's actually a newspaper man by the name of O'Sullivan in New York who coined the phrase manifest destiny. But it was this idea that it was America's God-given destiny to expand out to the West. That America needed to extend democracy, capitalism, Christianity, baseball, apple pie, all things American, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. Manifest Destiny really was a religious justification for westward expansion. And on the bottom right-hand side, you can see that painting. It's a pretty famous painting, actually. God's angel is heading west. She's bringing with her the light, the truth, the knowledge, the way. You can see behind her, there's light, there's trains, there's telegraph lines, there's settlers. And that as God's light moves to the west, it is driving out the buffalo and the Native American. So yeah, Manifest Destiny was this religious justification for westward expansion. But as I've always told my students, there were some tangible reasons for Manifest Destiny. Again, here we go using the Bible to justify our ends, just like slavery, right? But what I call the three real reasons for Manifest Destiny. Number one is the land itself. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. A lot of land out west. That's a lot of resources to get at. If I want to be a cynic, I could also argue that's a lot of tax dollars to someday generate. So the land itself is a real reason for Manifest Destiny. Another real reason for Manifest Destiny is it's a big long word called xenophobia. Spelled Xenophobia. Xenophobia. Xenophobia is a fear of foreigners. And America really wanted to drive foreign influence out of the West. They wanted to drive Mexico and England and Russia out of the West. So xenophobia was kind of like this idea of we need to get out west and drive all this foreign influence out of the continent as best we can. Number one was the land itself. Number two was xenophobia. And number three really was a big thing. It was trade and the desire to expand the U.S. economy more out to the west. Now, trade, not just in the sense of, you could make American products in New York, Boston, place like that, and then you could sell them in Texas, California, Colorado, and that's new markets for sure. But also trade in the sense of connecting American markets all the way to Asia. The idea there was is if we could somehow get out to California, go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we could build a train and it could go from New York all the way out to San Francisco and chugga chugga choo choo, all in points in between. And yeah, we can make American products in New York, put them on a train, send them out to San Francisco, put them on boats, sell that stuff across the Pacific Ocean, and then we could sell that stuff in China, Japan, Korea, and open up Asia to American products. You guys might remember when we started this class, we were talking about a man named Columbus, right? And he had this big dream of a westward route to Asia. Well, that dream is still very much alive. It's just now we know there's a North and South America continent in the way. But the Columbus dream, or the dream of Columbus, has not died. We're still seeking that westward route to Asia. It's just now you got to go across a whole continent. And with trains, you can do that rather rapidly. Put that stuff on a boat out in San Francisco, send it on to Asia, make that money. So that's what Polk is arguing for. Westward expansion of the United States, get Texas, Oregon, and California. And in that, we get a lot of land. We drive foreign influence out of the West, and we can trade American products across North America and eventually someday ship them all the way out to Asia. Make more profit, make more money. So James K. Polk becomes the Manifest Destiny candidate. He has the Democratic Party all kinds of energized for westward expansion. And poor old Henry Clay, he just never really quite could put his finger on the pulse of the American people. Clay, like right before the election took place, he was actually told by some of his campaign organizers that he wasn't getting a lot of play down in the Deep South. You can look how this 1844 election map plays out on the top right-hand side. He didn't get a lot of votes down there. South Carolina, Georgia, all the way out to Louisiana, Arkansas. The Deep South really didn't go with Henry Clay. But anyway, his organizers told him that he should go down south and give some speeches. Do his best to try to rally what support he could. So Clay found himself in Alabama, talking to crowds of people down in Alabama. And while he was there, he made some really foolish statements. I can't help but wonder if he thought the newspapers weren't there. They were there. But while in Alabama, Clay said that he had changed his mind about the annexation of Texas. He said he'd given the matter a lot of thought and had decided that he now stood for the annexation of the annexation of Texas, even if that caused a war with Mexico. Well, it didn't change anybody's mind in Alabama about Henry Clay. They weren't going to vote for him. But it did change some minds up north. In particular, people living in New York and Pennsylvania at that point said, I don't know if I can trust Henry Clay. He says he opposes something, but now he's all for it. So in New York and Pennsylvania, a lot of people chose to vote for the Liberty Party rather than vote for either Clay or Polk. And like people who have way more free time than I do and probably make more money than I do, have gone back and looked at this election, and they swear that if Clay had just stuck to his opposition to the annexation of Texas, he would have carried New York and Pennsylvania. Now, it would have been by very slim margins, but Clay would have won those states. If he had, you take those two big states away from Polk, you throw him into Clay's column, and he would have gone on to be the president of the United States. So Clay shot himself in the foot with those silly statements down in Alabama. Cost him support up there in New York and Pennsylvania. And he would go to his grave knowing that this was the one he should have won. He had it in the palm of his hand, and he let it slip by making those silly statements way down there in Alabama. Well, the Liberty Party is still kicking around here in 1844. Bernie is still their candidate for president, and they still only have that one topic that they stand for, which is opposition to slavery. You can see in this campaign the Liberty Party gets 62,000 votes. That's up quite a bit, and that goes back to that people in New York and Pennsylvania voting Liberty Party rather than voting for either Clay or Polk. So the Liberty Party is still keeping that argument alive. It's still keeping slavery in the political debate. All right, but when America votes, Polk wins. He says it's a clear mandate from the people. It's not really if you factor in the foolishness that Clay did. But anywho, Polk does win. He gets the Electoral College votes. And in becoming president of the United States, Polk says we're going to get Texas. We're going to get as much of Oregon as we can. By God, we're going to get California too. Well, as it turns out, before Polk is even sworn in, the Texas annexation question gets mostly resolved. Hold on a second. John Tyler knew that he didn't have a lot of time left as president. He knew his political future was pretty much done right there. So with what little time John Tyler had left, he got Calhoun to shut up about all that positive good talk. And Calhoun and Tyler together worked real hard to get Texas into the Union before he left the White House. And sure enough, on like the last day you possibly really could, on March the 3rd, 1845, like the next day is Inauguration Day. The next day, Polk is president. But on March the 3rd, 1845, the United States Congress gave Texas the answer that it wanted. The Congress said yes to the annexation of Texas on March the 3rd, 1845. So right as Polk is walking into the White House, Texas is annexed. It's in the Union. But shortly after Mexico gets word of the annexation of Texas by the United States, Mexico gets a little upset. Mexico will break off diplomatic ties with the United States. They don't really want to talk or have anything to do with our country at that point. And Mexico will make it very clear to the United States that the annexation of Texas only extends to the Nueces River. It doesn't go all the way down to the Rio Grande. So there's going to be a border dispute between the United States and Mexico over what is and is not Texas. So Clay was right. It did cause some animosity with Mexico, and ultimately it is going to trigger a war with Mexico. He's also right in this regard. The annexation of Texas is going to cause slavery to become a more divisive and bitter issue in the country as well. It's one thing to be right; it's another thing to be president sometimes. Clay never did become president of the United States. All right, well, let's start by looking at the Oregon question because this has a simple answer. California and Texas, not so much. All right, Polk and the Oregon question. All right, so Polk in becoming president, he's looking at a map similar to what we see here, and he sees that there is a line that's really heading pretty straight out to the west, and that line is along the 49-degree line on our map. It's just a straight line that's heading out towards the Pacific Ocean. And James K. Polk says, you know what? This makes perfect sense to me. Let's just compromise right there on the 49-degree line. North of 49 degrees belongs to Canada. South of 49 degrees belongs to the United States. And he made the British what he thought was a very fair offer, splitting it right there along 49 degrees. Well, these are just negotiations. And the British don't have to say yes. They're just talking at this point. And the British reject the offer. The British say, you know, actually, we've got some areas where we've got some fur trapping involved. People are trapping like beaver pelts and things like that. If you look on the map on the far left-hand side where it's all purple, says Oregon country. There's this sort of blue-green in the middle of all that. That area right there, the British want to hang on to that. The British say, look, we're making money off that. We got companies out there. So the British don't accept 49 degrees. These are just talks. There's nothing more than negotiations right here. But President Polk got upset that England would not accept his offer. So he said, okay, you reject my fair offer. Let's see how you like these apples. He said, I'm going to take the entirety of the Oregon country. 54-40, I'm taking it all. And if you don't like that, we'll go to war. I'll send the U.S. Army up into that part of the world and I'll take it by force. There you go. Either you accept 54-40 or fight. And this is a very big game of poker that President Polk is playing. The British could respond by saying, all right, let's have at it. Let's go to war. But I think fortunately for everyone involved, the British, they say, you know what? 49 degrees sounds lovely. I guess we could settle there. The British really aren't looking to go to war with the United States. So because of the threat of a war, a threat of invading up to 54-40, the British will get what they can. They'll agree to the 49-degree line on the map. So rattling the saber, threatening war, is going to lead the British to compromise right there along 49 degrees on the map. It's crazy. This could have led to a war. The U.S. military could have been fighting in the Northwest, while at the same time having to fight down in the Southwest. Because though Oregon was settled with words, with compromise, with diplomacy, it turns out the problems with Texas and California, and not so much. That's going to be a little bit harder of a thing to solve. Okay, and looking at this Mexican-American War, I think the first statement that should be made is the United States started this war. We are the aggressor here. There's no two ways about that. And in looking at what caused the war with Mexico, Texas is a part of that. That border dispute, does it go to the Rio Grande? Does it go to the Nueces? Not quite clear. So the border of Texas is a part of the animosity, the hostility between the two countries. Remember I told you just a minute ago, Mexico broke off diplomatic ties. But really the big overarching reason for this war was California and Polk's desire to acquire California. California at this point, mid-1840s, it's already known as a paradise on earth. They haven't even found gold yet, you know what I'm saying? But it's already known for like growing fruits, vegetables, just beautiful weather. But also above all else, California straddles the Pacific Ocean. And California has this nice little city called San Francisco that the United States would really like to get its hands on. San Francisco is a natural port city. It's just this great little location that's set up in a way where you can land a lot of ships. You can load and offload a bunch of cargo. San Francisco was just born to be a port city, and the United States really wanted to get its hands on the port of San Francisco. So looking at point number 2 here, President Polk wanted to diplomatically try to resolve these issues with Mexico. He wanted to use words rather than weapons. A man by the name of James Slidell, that's Slidell, was sent down to Mexico City to try to negotiate with the government of Mexico to solve these problems. Slidell's orders were to offer Mexico $25 million to settle the border of Texas at the Rio Grande and to include enough of California that at least had San Francisco in the deal. So James Slidell is sent to Mexico City to negotiate with the Mexican government. He can offer $25 million to get the border of Texas to the Rio Grande and to acquire enough of California that at least includes San Francisco. All right, well, Slidell travels down to Mexico City, and when he arrives in Mexico City, he's told by the government, we're not talking to you. We've broke off diplomatic ties. We're upset. We really don't have anything to say to the United States of America. But Slidell was a pretty persistent guy. He kept demanding an audience. He kept demanding a meeting. And at some point, some members of the Mexican government agreed to meet with Slidell, not in an official capacity, just sort of like at a hotel. We'll hear what you have to say. But I think it is important to understand this was not an official government of Mexico meeting that took place. All right, but Slidell gets his meeting with some representatives of Mexico's government, and he makes the offer. $25 million US for the Texas border to be extended to the Rio Grande, and to acquire enough of California that at least includes the city of San Francisco. Well, those men who represented the government of Mexico, they laughed at Slidell, and they said, "Yeah, that ain't gonna happen." They said, "You and I both know that San Francisco alone is worth more than $25 million. You're lowballing in your offer." And these Mexican officials also said, "And so what? You guys don't want to apologize for what you've done to this point? You're just the arrogant Americans who go down here and come down here and throw your money around like it solves all your problems. You know what? Go back and tell your president no." And not only do we say no, but it's very rude of him to come down here and just throw money in our face this way. It's not just a no, it's an emphatic no with a tint of anger and resentment. So Slidell sends word back to President Polk and says, yeah, words aren't going to work. They're too angry. They're too upset. It's going to take more than words to make this happen. So then President Polk decided to put things into motion, ideas into motion, that would ultimately trigger a war with Mexico. And through that war with Mexico, the United States would get the border of Texas to be the Rio Grande, and the country would acquire a heck of a lot more than just California at the end of this conflict. All right, looking at Zachary Taylor, the guy on the bottom left-hand side of our slide, and point number 3, Zach Taylor in northern Mexico. President Polk orders Zachary Taylor, the general in the U.S. Army, to march with his troops down to the city of Corpus Christi, Texas. If you look at our map on the far right-hand side, there's a lot of blue arrows kind of there in the middle along the border of the Rio Grande. If you look at the blue arrow above all that where it says Corpus Christi, Zach Taylor's army went to Corpus Christi, where it was told to wait there along the Nueces River. Even Mexico at that moment would recognize that that's U.S. soil, right there along the Nueces River. All right, well, what President Polk hoped would happen is that Mexico would send a big army to counter Zach Taylor, and that this army of Mexico would cross the Rio Grande and be on the other side of the Nueces, ready to pounce, ready for war. This is what's in Polk's mind. If he can get the army of Mexico onto U.S. soil, into that area that's in pink there, above the Rio Grande, somewhere between the Rio Grande and the Nueces, if he can get the army of Mexico onto that land, he could make the argument that America has been invaded, and he can make the argument for war with Mexico on the grounds of they've invaded the United States. Well, Mexico's not dumb. Mexico didn't take that bait. Mexico did send a large army over to the city of Matamoros, right there on the Rio Grande, right there along the border. But there, that Mexican army sat and waited, not crossing the Rio Grande, not provoking the conflict. So at that point, Polk realized that Mexico didn't take the bait, and he ordered Zachary Taylor to march his army down to the Rio Grande itself, to cross the Nueces and head into what we're claiming is U.S. soil, all the way down to the Rio Grande River. That's a double there. All the way down to the Rio Grande. Sorry. All right. When armies are that close to one another, and the only thing separating them is the river itself. On one side of the river, you got Zach Taylor, the U.S. Army. On the other side of the river is Matamoros, where the Mexican army is waiting to see what happens. But when you have military units that close to each other, mistakes get made. Some damn fool does something they shouldn't do. And that's exactly what happens here when in late April of 1846, it's actually Mexico that makes the first move. That Army of Mexico and Matamoros needed some information. They wanted to know exactly what they were up against if a conflict should start. So they sent some spies across the Rio Grande to basically see where the Americans are, how many soldiers they have. The heck are we facing here if it should come to war? A detachment of cavalry, these are men on horseback, will cross the Rio Grande under the cover of night. And that really was the problem here. They were running around in the dark. It's hard to do night operations back then. But anyway, they crossed the Rio Grande under the cover of darkness. They're riding back towards where the American army is. And unbeknownst to them, as they go over this hill, and they're starting to come down a hill, right on the other side of that hill are U.S. soldiers. They're sitting there encamped. They got a campfire going. And the American soldiers look up to see horses headed their way. Mexican soldiers come over the hill, and they're like, oh, dear God, there's soldiers at the bottom of this hill. And the Americans pick up their guns and start firing. As far as they know, the war has started. They don't know what's going on. The Mexican cavalry return fire as they're trying to get their horses turned around and headed back the other way. And a gunfight breaks out here along the border. U.S. soldiers were killed. Mexican soldiers were killed. And it's the first engagement of what becomes the Mexican-American War. By the way, the first casualty for the United States in this conflict was a Lieutenant Brown of the U.S. Army. And that city there along the border of the Rio Grande of Texas and Mexico, that city right there is Brownsville. And that's named in honor of Lieutenant Brown, the first casualty of the war with Mexico. All right, well, that information travels back east to Washington, D.C. The national government is told of a dust-up on the border, an exchange, a firefight between U.S. and Mexican soldiers. And James Polk is very pleased. The president is quite happy. He goes before Congress and says that American blood has been spilled on American soil, and he asks Congress for a declaration of war in early May of 1846. The Congress will agree with his assessment that, in fact, American blood had been spilled on American soil. Not everyone in Congress agreed. There were some people up north who were very concerned about this war, about its possibilities for slavery to the West. But the majority of Congress said yes. President Polk got his war. So in May of 1846, it's on. We're at war. The United States is fighting against Mexico. You can see there's a lot going on here in this war with Mexico. If I could look at the sort of red arrows, kind of look in the middle of the United States, coming out of Fort Leavenworth, there's an army of the West that you can see traveled west under the command of a General Kearny. And that army's job was to march all the way to California and liberate California from Mexican control. Journalists were allowed to travel with these units, these armies, but not a single journalist wanted to travel with Kearny and his boys. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but basically they traveled across the American Southwest, the desert part of America, and like this is some of the hottest parts of North America that they traveled through. Like Death Valley is somewhere along that route. And Kearny and his boys, the poor things, by the time they reached California, some of his men had died of dehydration, exposure to the sun. All of them were sunburnt and blistered. And Kearny and his boys didn't so much liberate California as survive the weather. And truth be told, by the time Kearny and his boys really got to California, the people of California had risen up themselves, had declared their own independence and broken away from Mexico when the fighting began. So yeah, it's kind of sad Kearny and his boys need not have made that march out to the west. But there's really two things I want to concentrate more than anything else. One is Zach Taylor in northern Mexico, and the other is Winfield Scott out in the Gulf of Mexico. If you look to the Gulf of Mexico, you can see those green arrows kind of going through that part of the world. Let's see, Zach Taylor's army is called the Army of the Center. Their job is to invade northern Mexico. and defend Texas from a possible attack. The Green Arrows, under the command of General Winfield Scott, that's the Army of Invasion, and its job is to land at Veracruz and then go on and attack Mexico City. So the two key things I'm going to look at in talking about the war with Mexico are Zach Taylor in the Army of the Center and Winfield Scott in the Army of Invasion. All right, let's start with Taylor up there in northern Mexico. All right, once Zach Taylor got the command to go, he took off, and the U.S. Army crossed the Rio Grande and just smashed the city of Matamoros. What was left of the Mexican army at Matamoros retreated, ran for its life. Zach Taylor followed them on to the city of Monterrey, and there they leveled the city of Monterrey and just kept destroying the Mexican army wherever it went. So that what was happening in the early phases of this war is Zachary Taylor was becoming a hero back east in the United States. They were talking about him like he was the next George Washington, the next Andrew Jackson. And he was becoming an immensely popular figure back east in the United States. Everywhere Taylor went, he was just destroying whatever was in his path, in his wake. Well, again, journalists could travel with the army at this time, and a lot of newspaper reporters traveled with Zach Taylor's army. And there's this kind of a weird scene where the reporters get a chance to talk to the general. They get a chance to interview Zach Taylor. And while he's seated on the back of a camel with an umbrella sticking up above the camel, these newspaper journalists are walking along in the sun, sort of peppering him with questions. And, some of the questions are about the battles, the military tactics, and things like that. But then, the reporters start to asking questions like, what are your political leanings? And in that, he says that he's a Whig, that he respects Clay as a nationalist, and he thinks the Whigs have a good idea for the country. Okay, so this guy is a Whig in his politics. Then another question gets asked, well, have you ever thought about running for political office? Quite the hero back east. I bet you could be the governor of your home state of Louisiana or elected to Congress. Zach Taylor said that he had thought about politics. And he said, in fact, when this situation here in Mexico was resolved, he said he was thinking very seriously about running for the presidency of the United States. So he just kind of drops a small bombshell in the middle of nowhere in northern Mexico on the back of a camel while being interviewed by journalists that he's a Whig and he has aspirations for the White House. Well, at that moment, our president is a Democrat, and James K. Polk began to realize that he was looking at his opponent in the next campaign, that this is probably the guy he would face. He's immensely popular, and people back east are falling in love with Zach Taylor. So President Polk was afraid that this was the guy he'd be facing for a re-election in 1848. And this sounds kind of crazy, but President Polk allowed politics to play a role in the outcome of this war. Because really, Zach Taylor's destroying everything in his wake. He could keep marching on, and he could turn south and go to Mexico City. Zach Taylor could probably win this war all by himself. But that won't do. That won't be good for President Polk in the re-election campaign. So President Polk ordered Zach Taylor's army to stop, to halt, wherever it was. And by the time they got that message, that word, Zach Taylor's army was along the outskirts of a small little city called Buena Vista. I don't think anything ever happened there before. When this war is over with, I don't think anything's ever happened there since, in the sleepy little town of Buena Vista. Not only was Zach Taylor's army ordered to stop, but a good portion of his troops were made to march back to the Gulf Coast. There they would be picked up by Winfield Scott, used in the Army of Invasion. So Taylor's ordered to stop. He's had a large section of his army taken away. And Taylor's orders were to stay where he was and to act as a shield for Texas, to defend Texas from a possible attack by Mexico. And really what Polk is doing in that situation is he's saying, let's see you get headlines now. Let's see you get all big and famous now. He stops him from going any further. All right, well, Zach Taylor does as he's told. He stops. His army sort of settles in the sleepy little town of Buena Vista, and there they await further orders from the commander-in-chief. All right, now let's flip the coin and look at this war from Mexico's perspective. I do think it matters to look at what they're thinking. And when this war started, it didn't go very well for Mexico at all. They lose California right off the bat. The people of California rise up, make their own independence happen for them. So California's gone. Then you got this guy named Taylor who's running roughshod across the northern cities, smashing Matamoros, smashing Monterrey. And yeah, the people of Mexico very quickly lost faith in their government. The government collapsed there in Mexico City. The people of Mexico turned to an old friend to try to save them in these desperate moments. Santa Anna comes back. And the butcher of the Alamo is basically given the chance here to save these people, save Mexico from a complete and total disaster. So now Santa Anna is in charge of Mexico's resistance to this U.S. invasion. Well, Santa Anna looked at a map similar to what we have here on the top right, and he made some pretty astute conclusions. California's gone. That sucks. It really does. But it's so far away, and you've got more pressing matters. So they essentially had to write off California. And maybe when the fighting is over with, you could try to take it back somehow, but now, California is just simply gone. They don't really know about the Army of Invasion in the Gulf of Mexico. It's headed that way soon, but they don't really know about that. So the one thing that Santa Anna does know is that there is this dude named Taylor. He's running roughshod across the major cities to the north. So Santa Anna and the Army of Mexico decided to march on Zach Taylor to try to knock out that U.S. Army under Taylor's command. And I think it's not a bad plan if he could have pulled it off. After Santa Anna defeats Taylor's army, his plan is then to march on to Texas, capture Texas by force, and then force the United States to sue for peace and end the war. It's not a bad strategy. It's just pulling it off. So Santa Anna's army comes marching out of Mexico City. It's going north. They eventually find through scouts that the U.S. Army under Zach Taylor is secured in a small town called Buena Vista. So the Army of Mexico under Santa Anna will engage the U.S. Army under Taylor in this big battle called the Battle of Buena Vista. Buena Vista itself was surrounded by mountains. It was like inside a valley. And really the only option that the Mexican army had when it arrived was to attack up the front. What we call a full frontal assault against the U.S. Army. The Mexican army couldn't come in from the left or the right. That's called the flanks. Because that was surrounded by mountains. You cannot ask your men to climb mountains, then go down the side of mountains, then engage the enemy. So left, right, hitting in the flanks was not an option. Hitting in the rear was not an option either because, again, the mountains are to the rear. And really the only choice that Santa Anna had when he arrived was a full frontal assault into the valley right up the middle. You can win those battles, full frontal assault, but a lot of times when those battles are over with, you ask yourself, was it worth it? Because you tend to lose a lot of men when you engage that way. Zach Taylor's army was outnumbered at least 3-1. Some historians have actually said it was more like 4-1. I'll just go with this. The U.S. Army is heavily outnumbered at the Battle of Buena Vista. But one advantage they do have is Santa Anna has to attack full frontal assault. And this epic thing called the Battle of Buena Vista was a big, big battle in this war. And miraculously, the U.S. Army will hold on. It'll defeat Santa Anna's army. And yes, Buena Vista is a U.S. victory here in the middle of the Mexican-American War. Heavily outnumbered, Zach Taylor's army pulled off a miracle, held on and won the Battle of Buena Vista. Let's see. So, if the whole point of this was to keep Zach Taylor from getting headlines, that didn't work. He's now largely praised as a miracle worker, a hero. This is an epic battle that he's pulled off the victory in. And you can write this in your notes. You're writing a true statement. Winning the Battle of Buena Vista propels this guy into the White House. It's the reason really why he'll be the next president of the United States. So one hero of the Battle of Buena Vista is Zach Taylor, and this will lead to his presidency. He will win the next campaign for president of the United States. You can kind of see on that painting that I've put there on the slide on the bottom left. It's hard to make out, but it says the White House collection. Yeah, that'll be his presidential portrait later on down the road. Okay, well, another hero that was born there at the Battle of Buena Vista is also on our slide, and it's that gentleman there named Jefferson Davis with an amazing underbeard. I don't know why underbeards were all the rage at that time, but Jeff Davis and his underbeard will be a hero at the Battle of Buena Vista as well. Jeff Davis comes to us from Mississippi. He was an officer in Zach Taylor's army. In fact, he had married Zach Taylor's daughter years before all this. Tragically, she died along the way. But yeah, Zach Taylor and Jeff Davis knew each other. But anyway, Jeff Davis is an officer in Taylor's army, and Jeff Davis was at the front lines of the fighting in Buena Vista. He and his so-called Mississippi Rifles stayed there in the thick of it that day. And like when the fighting broke out, lead was flying like flies. Men were dropping left and right. Jeff Davis, for his part, he was shot in the leg. He took some shrapnel to an ankle, and he had to lean up against a rock formation to keep from falling over. So couldn't put any pressure on his leg. But he stayed there in the thick of it all, in the fighting, and he kept encouraging his men to fight, to fire. And for his acts of heroism and bravery on the field of battle, he'll be given all kinds of medals, accommodations, citations for merit. And Jeff Davis became a national hero because of the courage he showed there at the Battle of Buena Vista. For him, a big problem, though, is that leg. When the battle's over with, the doctors will look at it. They'll manage to get the lead out of him, if you will. But he's going to have to rest and recuperate for that leg to be worth anything. And basically, for him, the war was over at that point. He'll be sent back to Mississippi to rest and recuperate. He's told to basically be on bed rest, not put any pressure on that leg. Well, when Jeff Davis does arrive back in his home state of Mississippi, he's hailed as a hero. They declare it Jefferson Davis Day across the state. People hold barbecues and dances in his honor. And some members of the Democratic Party in Mississippi decided to pay Jeff Davis's plantation a visit. He was a slaveholder. In fact, he was one of the biggest slaveholders in the state of Mississippi. You could argue he was one of the biggest slaveholders in all of the United States. Anywho, some members of the Democratic Party do pay a visit to his plantation in Mississippi. And they basically say, you know, son, you're so popular, I swear you could be the governor of our state if you wanted to be. And they're asking him, have you ever thought about politics and running for high office? He thanked them for the time. He said that really wasn't what he was into. He was hoping his leg would recover, he could get back into the military. But along the way, it became very obvious to him that that leg wasn't fully going to heal, that probably his military career was over. So Jeff Davis contacted the Democratic Party of Mississippi and said, you know what? I think I could give politics a shot. And he'll run for the United States Congress. He'll later run as a United States Senator. Even further on down the road, he will be a Secretary of War. And on down the road, Jefferson Davis will be a president, just not of the United States. He'll be the one and only president that the Confederacy ever had, as he'll be basically put in charge of the South during the U.S. Civil War. So 2 presidents were made that day at Buena Vista. Zach Taylor of the United States and Jeff Davis of the Confederacy when we get on down to the Civil War. There's another fellow who was there that day, Henry Clay Jr., the son of Henry Clay, was there at the Battle of Buena Vista as well. But unfortunately, Henry Clay Jr. was killed in action there at the Battle of Buena Vista. With the death of his son, it really tore the heart out of Henry Clay, as it would any parent, to lose a son, to lose a child. But Clay went into kind of a dark period at that point in time. And it's really tragic for Clay in this sense. He really should have been president. He should have won that 1844 campaign. If he had, our country probably would not have gone to war, and his son probably would have still been alive. So I had to live with that fact, that losing the presidency also, in a sense, costs the life of his son. But yeah, Clay just was a ghost of what he used to be. He really was just sort of closed off from the world at that point. The old man did have one more rabbit left up his sleeve. We'll talk later about a compromise of 1850. But boy, it was really tough for Clay. Henry Clay losing his son there at the Battle of Buena Vista. All right, well, after the Battle of Buena Vista is over with, Santa Anna takes what's left of his army, marches it back to Mexico City, and basically just prepares for the end game. Prepares for what he knows eventually will come, the invasion of the capital of Mexico City. Back east, Taylor is a hero, Jeff Davis is a hero, and the Army of Mexico is preparing for the final assault. All right, well, Winfield Scott is the U.S. general in charge of that army of invasion. Scott and his boys got a boat ride across the Gulf of Mexico, and they will eventually land at this port city of Veracruz, which, if you'll remember, Veracruz is where Cortez and his men landed, right? Remember Cortez taking on the Aztec Empire? Well, here we are centuries later. The U.S. Army is landing in the same spot. And this so-called Battle of Veracruz was an amphibious assault. It was going from water to land. Historically speaking, amphibious assaults don't work very well. This one did, though. Later on, D-Day, during World War II, that's a big amphibious assault that'll take place, and that one worked. But Veracruz is where the U.S. military captures the port of Veracruz. At that point, you have the ability to land ships, offload soldiers and supplies. So Veracruz is like the first step of the invasion. Then you can see down there in southern Mexico, the very bottom right-hand side of our map, the U.S. military from there marches straight on to Mexico City. But that stretch of land between Veracruz and Mexico City was very fought for very hardly. The people of Mexico did not give up their capital without a fight. In fact, the heaviest of the casualties of this war happened on that road from Veracruz on to Mexico City. Along the way, some heroes are being made here as well. Let's see, Ulysses S. Grant was in Winfield Scott's army in this invasion of Mexico City. A fellow whose name is Thomas Jefferson Jackson. There's a lot of presidents involved in that name. Thomas Jefferson Jackson is in Winfield Scott's U.S. Army too. Later during the Civil War, he'll be nicknamed Stonewall. So Stonewall Jackson, though he's not named that yet, was learning a lot about war on this march to Mexico City. But the biggest name coming out of this road to Mexico City is the name of Robert E. Lee. Lee is a promising young officer under Winfield Scott's command. Lee just was tremendous in this conflict, played a huge role in capturing Mexico City. And when the war is over with, Winfield Scott, in writing his sort of review of the conflict, Winfield Scott said that Lee was the most promising officer that the U.S. Army had, and that someday he would probably be commander of the U.S. military on down the road. Well, Lee would be commanding military units, just not for the United States of America. Later on down the road, he'll be commanding Confederate forces during the U.S. Civil War. So a lot of these guys who become famous during the Civil War, they're kind of no names right now, but they're learning how to fight. They're learning how to command men in conflict here in Mexico. Well, in September of 1847, the U.S. Army captures Mexico City. U.S. troops come pouring in. So with that, the fighting is all but over. there's a few little skirmishes that'll happen here and there, but really the heaviest of the fighting ends in September of 1847 with the United States capturing the capital of Mexico City. At that point, the government in Mexico ran for its life. Santa Anna took off running. He escaped. He got out. Other members of the Mexican government ran as well. And really what we needed was the Mexican government to sit down and negotiate a treaty. We needed to figure out an end to this war. U.S. soldiers would go around in Mexico City with these, these pictures, these faces, and say, "Have you seen this person?" And it wasn't that they wanted to arrest anyone or kill anyone; they just wanted to meet with Mexico's government to negotiate a treaty. So it took a while to round up the government of Mexico to get them to negotiate a treaty. Once they did, it was agreed that the negotiations would take place in the small city of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Going on to point 5 here, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Guadalupe Hidalgo was a resort town. It's where rich people in Mexico City would go for the weekends to relax. So the American diplomats were like, well, if we're here, let's go live in a rich man's resort. And the treaty negotiations did take place at the city of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that's why they've borne that name ever since, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It'll be signed in February of 1848. The negotiations were very lopsided, one-sided. But here are the details of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Number 1, it ends the war. So the Mexican-American War ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Number 2, the Rio Grande is the border of Texas, has been ever since. So number 2, the Rio Grande is the border of Texas. Number 3, Mexico will acquire what's called the United States will acquire what's called the Mexican Cession. And you can see all that land there in that shade of gray that's got California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, half New Mexico, a chunk of Colorado, and on it goes. All of that land is the Mexican Cession. So point number 3, the United States basically acquires the Southwest all the way out to California. So, number 1, it's the end of the war with Mexico. Number 2, the Rio Grande is the border of Texas. Number 3, the United States acquires the Mexican Cession. And number 4, Mexico will be given $15 million to give up any claims that she may have to the land in question. If you recall, the original price tag was $25 million to have the border be the Rio Grande and to get enough of California that included San Francisco. But now that we've had a war and got troops on the capital of Mexico City, the price tag goes down to 15. So with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the fighting comes to an end. The border dispute for Texas is settled. The United States gets more than just California. It gets all that land to the southwest. And Mexico is given $15 million to give up any legal claims that she may have to the land in question. Let's see. Sometimes a good question gets asked in a face-to-face class. Why didn't the United States just take Mexico? Take the whole thing? Well, there's some reasons behind that. Number 1, there was a lot of talk in Mexico about a people's uprising. That though the government may have collapsed and the U.S. Army had taken the capital, there was talk of people sort of forming militia units and fighting it back against the United States as an occupying force. Really what America wanted to do was get its land and get the heck out of Dodge. So there's talk of an uprising. The longer we stay, the more likely it is that the people of Mexico rebel. So, yeah, there's that. And I promise you, if the United States had said we take all of Mexico, it absolutely would have triggered an uprising. Prolong this war even further. Let's see. Number 2, there was congressmen up north who wanted this war over immediately. They were very concerned already about the land out west and could it possibly have slavery within its borders. And there was a real concern from politicians up north that if we took Mexico, that slavery would extend there on into the south. So there are those who oppose slavery, who are upset a little bit about all this. And the last reason is it's not a good reason. It is what it is. It's racism. John C. Calhoun, in particular, had a lot to say about this. And Calhoun said that the United States should not take Mexico because these are his words, not mine. Calhoun said that they were a lesser people, those who lived in Mexico, and he said that bringing these lesser people into our country would make our country weaker. So racism, as expressed by guys like Calhoun, is another reason why the United States did not take all of Mexico. All right, well, the war is over. The Rio Grande is the border of Texas. The United States now extends all the way out to California in the southwest, and Mexico gets $15 million at the end of the war. Now, back east, there's a lot of patriotic pride, and there's a lot of waving of the flag. But there are also quite a few people who are worried here at the end of this war. And looking at point number 6, a dose of arsenic. That's a quote from a fellow named Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American literary figure, said that the United States winning this war is like a man drinking a dose of arsenic. He said winning this war is going to poison the United States. That's kind of a dramatic thing to say in our moment of triumph, I guess. But here's what Emerson is driving at. Emerson was afraid, as were others, that the issue of slavery out west was going to destroy our country. That, okay, we've got all this new land out to California, but now we're going to start fighting over whether or not slavery should expand out to that land in California. And he knew that the people of the North would say, no, we don't want slavery out there. And he knew that people down south would argue, well, it should be allowed to spread out there. So that's a real concern. As the country expands to the west, are we going to allow slavery to expand to the west? That's the arsenic. That's the poison, the institution of slavery. And truth be told, Ralph Waldo Emerson was correct. Winning this war did destroy the United States of America. The America that he grew up in, anyway, that he knew, it did die. That America will die because of this. It'll die in civil war. But then when the Civil War comes to an end, a new America will be born. There will be a new birth of freedom, as Abraham Lincoln will call it. And a new America will emerge that is free of slavery, that is free of the evil institution. So, yes, this was like a man drinking a dose of arsenic. The America that Emerson grew up in did die because of this war. But I would argue a better nation was born out of what was to come. And with what we have left of our semester, we're now like, what, 75% through? We've got this one more unit to go through in Civil War. Really, what's left of our semester, this is what we're going to deal with. This basic question. As America heads west, are we going to allow slavery to head west as well? So that's going to be the question that we face in these next few topics to come. All right, well, that's it as far as material for exam number 3. Be sure you're taking notes, studying those notes. I'll post a review as well to get you ready for exam number 3. So that the material I start talking about in the next topic, that stuff that'll be on our last exam number 4.